So up until now, we've been focusing on defining behavior. We've been focusing on observing behavior, measuring behavior, graphing behavior, and visual analysis of those graphs of behavior. But now we're going to start taking a look at how to modify behavior. And we're going to start with everybody's favorite, positive reinforcement. Hi, my name is Dr. Igor Juricevic, and this is Functional Analysis of Behavior 1. Let's go. Okay, so we introduced positive reinforcement in a previous video, and if you haven't seen that video or if you need to jog your memory, I highly recommend going and watching it before continuing on with this video. But just as a quick reminder, positive reinforcement is what occurs when a response is followed by the presentation of a stimulus, and the presentation of that stimulus increases the future frequency or the future intensity, basically the future amount of that response. So the response occurs, the consequence follows. If that consequence is positive reinforcement, then that response is going to increase in the future. So that is the key hallmark of reinforcement, that it increases in the future, and it's positive because something is presented. Okay, so something is presented, that positive reinforcer is presented, and what we're going to focus on in this video is we're going to take a look at the 5 classifications of reinforcers by their formal properties. So we're going to take a look at 5 categories of reinforcers defined by their formal, aka their physical properties, and we're going to take a look at each of those so that we can choose from a wide variety of reinforcers. And that's going to be important later as we talk about the guidelines for how to use positive reinforcers. But let's focus on the task at hand. What are those 5 classifications of positive reinforcers? Classification number 1. So we're going to start with the one that most people think of when they think of positive reinforcers, and those are edible reinforcers. So if the consequence of a behavior is an edible reinforcer, that means that the consequence of a behavior can be bites of a preferred food. It can be snacks, it can be candy, it can be sips of drinks that a person enjoys. Basically anything that is eaten that later on increases the behavior is an edible reinforcer, in this case an edible positive reinforcer. Category number 2. So next we have the category of sensory reinforcers. And these are forms of sensory stimulation that, when they're a consequence of a behavior, increase the frequency or the intensity of that behavior in the future. So forms of sensory stimulation that can act as positive reinforcer include things like massages, include things like, especially for children, tickles, presentation of sparkling lights. The presentation of music is often used as a positive reinforcer, a positive sensory reinforcer. So these are all forms of sensory stimulation that can be added to an environment, hence the positive, and increase the likelihood that a behavior will occur in the future, hence reinforcement. Category number 3. All right, so the next category of positive reinforcers that we're going to talk about are tangible reinforcers. And these are things that you can touch. Now you might be thinking back to the edible reinforcers and saying, hey, aren't those tangible reinforcers? Well, these are things that you can touch. A tangible reinforcer would be something that you can touch, but not something that you would eat. So a tangible reinforcer, things that you can touch, think of things like stickers, think of things like little prizes that you get, in the bottom of those cereal boxes. Think of little trinkets, trading cards, small toys, soft pajamas, anything that you can actually touch can be used as a tangible reinforcer. So again, you present that as a consequence of a behavior that's positive. And if it's a tangible reinforcer, the behavior that was reinforced will increase in the future. Category number 4. Category number 4 is activity reinforcers. Now this is a very important one because you can actually reinforce a behavior with other behaviors. So the opportunity to engage in certain behaviors can be used as a positive reinforcement for behaviors that you want to increase. So if somebody does a behavior and you want to increase that behavior, you could give it an activity reinforcer as a consequence. And these include activities, preferred activities such as playing a board game, activities such as reading, activities such as watching a movie, or it can also include special privileges such as going to lunch at a restaurant, such as being able to choose something from the supermarket. such as being first in line when you go out for recess. All of these things are activities that can be used to reinforce a behavior, hence positive reinforcement. So one of my favorite real world stories of activity reinforcers in use comes from Jim Carrey. So when Jim Carrey was a elementary school student, he was very active. He was very hyperactive. He would be very disruptive in class. And Carrey's 7th grade teacher came to him with a contingency and said, Jim, if you leave the other children in peace all day, if you're basically not a disturbance to the class for the entire day, I will give you 15 minutes in front of the class at the end of the day, and you can do whatever material you've been working on. So she was giving him the opportunity to engage in stand-up comedy at the end of the day to reinforce the behavior of not being disruptive, of sitting there, paying attention. She used a positive reinforcer of here's 15 minutes at the end of the day, do your stand-up routine in order to reinforce those helpful behaviors. So activity reinforcers, they're very important because they can be very varied. They can be things like doing stand-up comedy in front of the class. They can be things like playing tennis. They can be things like playing with dolls. And it's very important to know how to use these activity reinforcers. So we're going to talk very quickly about 2 theories about how to implement these activity reinforcers. So the first one we're going to talk about is the Premack principle. And the Premack principle states that any behavior that occurs at a naturally high rate, so when you're measuring the baseline of a behavior, any behavior that occurs at a naturally high rate can be used to reinforce any other behavior that occurs at a low rate. So if in your baseline measures of a person's behavior, you notice that they do something at a very high rate, such as watch TV, and they do something at a very low rate, such as doing homework, the Premack principle says watching TV can be used to reinforce doing homework. So a high rate behavior can be used as an activity reinforcer to reinforce a low rate behavior. And the other principle we're going to talk about for activity reinforcers is the response deprivation hypothesis. Now, this is a personal favorite of mine because of how versatile it is. And it states that if access to any behavior, and that's the gold in it, is that if access to any behavior is restricted, number 1, restricted, and number 2, falls below the preferred rate. So whatever the preferred rate for that behavior is, then that behavior can be used as a positive activity reinforcer. So it doesn't matter if it's a high level behavior reinforcing a low level behavior, any behavior has a level. And if you can restrict that behavior so that it falls below its preferred rate, then you know that you are dealing with an activity reinforcer according to the response deprivation hypothesis. So if somebody likes to dance for 1 hour a day, and you have the ability, you have the authority and the power to restrict that, so they're only dancing for half an hour a day, the response deprivation hypothesis says dancing can now be used as an activity reinforcer. All right, positive reinforcement formal property category number 5. All right, so the final category that we're going to talk about is also a very important one because of how easily they are implemented and given, and those are social reinforcers. So humans are very social creatures. We live in a society. All right, so we're very social creatures, and signs of social approval can be used as positive reinforcement. Signs of acceptance can be used as positive reinforcement. So hugs can be positively reinforcing. Pats on the back can be positively reinforcing. These are all signs in our society that, hey, you are doing a good job. The phrase, hey, you are doing a good job, can be a social reinforcer. Things like proximity, standing near a person, approaching a person, just kind of being close to them. Things like attention, giving somebody your attention, giving somebody praise, saying, hey, that was a great job. Hey, attaboy, attagirl, way to go. All of those are social reinforcers, and some of the power of social reinforcers is the fact that we carry those all around with us all the time. So you might not always have an edible reinforcer sitting in your pocket. You might not always have a tangible reinforcer in your bag, but you always have the ability to give somebody your attention, you always have the ability to say to somebody, hey, that was really, really good. You always have those social reinforcers that you can use in positive reinforcement. All right, so that's it for today's video. So today we took a look at positive reinforcers as we begin our look at behavior modification. We took a look at the 5 categories of positive reinforcers, starting with edible reinforcers, then sensory reinforcers, tangible reinforcers. We took a look at activity reinforcers, including the 2 theories of activity reinforcers, the Premack principle and the response deprivation hypothesis. And then we ended it with a look at social reinforcers, the reinforcers that you always carry along with you. So that's it for today's video. Next time, we're going to take a look at how to apply these reinforcers effectively when we take a look at 9 guidelines for positive reinforcement. So until then, thank you for joining me, and stay frosty, stay functional. So they can be things like tennis, they can be things like playing with dolls, they can be things like, what was the other example that I used? I'm trying to remember my own slides here.